which has caused too much misery. Far too many fought for too long. This must be accompanied by meaningful, coordinated, reciprocal, and verifiable actions related to the Steps for Steps initiative. This includes progress on the missing, the disappeared, and those arbitrarily detained in Syria. President, in conclusion, Malta urges maximum restraint for all parties in Syria and the region at this time of escalation. We once again reiterate our call for the nationwide ceasefire in Syria and for parties to refrain from further action which could tip the region into greater calamity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I speak on behalf of Brazil and Switzerland, co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and the Director of OCHA's Operations and Advocacy Division, Edem Vazornu, for their briefings. We also acknowledge the presence of representatives from Syria, Turkey, and Iran at today's meeting. Brazil and Switzerland remain deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria and the increase in hostilities across the country. According to OCHA, the escalation of violence in the northwest has damaged several health facilities and schools and displaced more than 120,000 people across Idlib and western Aleppo. Unsurprisingly, with the lack of security and safety, aid operations have temporarily been disrupted and, sadly, 3 humanitarian aid workers have been killed, as have been dozens of civilians. The northeast has been also affected by the increased hostilities. Civilian infrastructure, including water and power stations, farms, sites in direct vicinity of civilian villages and IDP camps have been targeted. The attacks, including on infrastructures that are indispensable to the survival of the population, have caused displacement both within the northeast as well as to the government-controlled areas of Syria. Repeated strikes on Aleppo and Damascus airports have also disrupted UN humanitarian air service flights more than once. Moreover, across the country, the escalations of hostilities have impacted aid delivery as organizations are forced to suspend activities due to security concerns. Any further escalation of hostilities will inevitably obstruct the delivery of life-saving assistance and pose immediate threats to the safety of aid workers and communities alike. It will increase the plight of the civilian population that already faces a humanitarian crisis that is worse than ever in Syria's 12-year history of conflict. A long-lasting ceasefire across the country is the only way to prevent further deaths, injury, and human suffering. We call on all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, in particular, to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need across all Syria, to follow the rules related to the conduct of hostilities, in particular the prohibition of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures, to guarantee the safety and well-being of the people living in Syria. Mr. President, it is worrisome that the humanitarian response plan remains heavily underfunded, with only 1/3 of the requested funds covered. The lack of resources is limiting the UN's and its partners' ability to support the affected population. All modalities of aid, including cross-border and cross-line, must be kept available for humanitarian organizations to be able to keep offering their much-needed assistance across Syria. We appreciate that deliveries of essential humanitarian aid continue to pass through the Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam, and Bab al-Ray border crossings. Given the large scale of needs, ensuring humanitarian access remains crucial. We trust that the authorization for Bab al-Salam and al-Ray border crossings, due to expire on 13 November, will be renewed. We also reiterate the necessity of predictable arrangements to respond to those ever-increasing humanitarian needs on the ground, which would be facilitated by open-ended or longer durations of permissions. In closing, the humanitarian situation in Syria is dire, and it risks to keep getting worse. It is important to ensure that recent developments in the region do not contribute to a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Syria. In the midst of conflict and crisis in the Near East, let us not forget the people in Syria. I thank you. Monsieur le Président.
President, I would now like to make a statement in my national capacity on the political situation in Syria. Switzerland is very concerned about the risk of regional escalation resulting from the conflict in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory since the 7th of October. We support the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen, whom I thank for his briefing, to immunize Syria as much as possible from such a scenario. The repeated attacks on Damascus and Aleppo airports over the past 3 weeks and the firing on the occupied Golan Heights are just one example of how the repercussions of the Middle East conflict are already being felt in Syria. We regret that the current situation is further hampering efforts to relaunch the political process and the work of the Constitutional Committee on the basis of Resolution 2254. The security situation, particularly in the north of the country, has deteriorated significantly in recent weeks. In northwest Syria, the attack on a military academy in Homs on the 5th of October resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, including many civilians. The bombardments that followed in various parts of the Idlib region and to the west of Aleppo had serious repercussions on the civilian population and led to large-scale displacement. In the northeast, the upsurge in violence has also affected the population and many civilian infrastructures. Respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians are a priority for Switzerland. This is why we're calling on all parties to establish a national ceasefire and to ensure the protection of civilians. It is essential that all parties respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law and the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. The protection of civilian population and civilian property, including infrastructure indispensable to the survival of civilians, such as water supplies, is imperative. President, in this period of high regional and international tension, it is vital to remain attentive to civil society, which is the only one capable of taking the pulse of the situation on the ground and capturing the aspirations, grievances and expectations of the population, particularly women. Switzerland therefore reiterates its support for civil society organisations active inside and outside Syria, which play a crucial role in easing the tensions and conflicts still at work in the country. We welcome the transmission role played by the Civil Society Support Room and the Women's Advisory Board under the aegis of the UN in Geneva. Platforms such as these enable the voices of Syrian women and men to be heard at international level and all the way up to this Council. Finally, Switzerland recalls that the implementation of confidence-building measures within the meaning of Resolution 2254 and by all parties, including the release of detainees and the clarification of the fate of missing persons, are essential to pave the way for reconciliation in the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, President. Envoy Pedersen was soon for their briefings. Today, we heard again the call for resuming the political process based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and the need for the Constitutional Committee
to reconvene and achieve genuine progress. It's not just a wishful line, but a matter of life and death for millions of Syrians who are deprived of dignity, have their freedom oppressed, and no means to rebuild their shattered lives. Albania reiterates its position that only a political solution based on the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 may bring an end to the suffering in Syria. We welcome the engagement of Special Envoy in this regard and the contribution of Women Advisory Board. It can unlock and provide the necessary conditions to be met for the dignified and safe return of the refugees. It can further ensure that justice is served for those responsible for war crimes, enforced displacement and torture. This is not just a moral imperative, but a legal obligation under international law and a fundamental element towards
reconciliation, and prevention of inhuman crimes in the future. It can also shed light for the families whose the fate of their loved ones is unknown. Above all, a renewed political momentum, followed with step-for-step approach, would only guarantee sustainable solutions to the humanitarian and economic tragedy. The reassumption of cross-border aid in northwest Syria from Ab al-Waw, although a positive note, is not enough. The other cross-borders of Bab al-Salam and al-Aray should be extended beyond their deadline, and the continuation of a predictable and measurable life-saving humanitarian flow must be guaranteed for as long as needed. President, we are deeply worried for the intense and systematic artillery and missile attacks by the regime in northwest Syria, which have added an extra layer of misery for ordinary Syrians, and especially to children, women, and girls. In this context, we join the call of Special Envoy for de-escalation and for the national ceasefire to be respected throughout the country and for common sense to prevail. President, in concluding, as mentioned also by others, the balances in the wider region are merely holding together, and the situation in the Middle East has brought dark clouds for the regional peace and also for the future of Syria. And here again, we join the call of Special Envoy for all actors to exercise maximum restraint, and that the regional and international actors must continue their efforts in order to respond wisely to this new reality and avoid any spillover effect for the wider region. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we heard from the briefings by Special Envoy Pedersen and Ms. Vosorunu today, there have been a number of alarming recent events that threatens the already precarious security and humanitarian environment in Syria. I thank both briefers for their detailed briefings. Mr. President, first, the situation in Israel and Palestine has a worrying risk of regional spillover. Already, there are reports of exchanges of cross-border fire in the Golan Heights and the strikes on the Damascus and Aleppo international airports. Japan will continue to work in close cooperation with the international community, including the UN, to calm the situation as soon as possible. Additionally, devastating drone attacks in Homs and retaliatory shelling over Idlib have caused hundreds of casualties, damage to civilian facilities, and further displacement. This constitutes the largest escalation of hostilities in Syria in 4 years, according to the UN Commission of Inquiry and Mr. Pedersen's briefing now. Japan echoes the Secretary General's condemnation of all violence in Syria and reiterates his call for all parties to respect their obligations under international law and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure at all times. Mr. President, the latest violence only worsens the already dire humanitarian situation in Syria. While Japan is pleased that UN aid deliveries into northwest Syria from Turkey have continued this month, we encourage further vital assistance through all modalities, including cross-border and cross-line. It is truly regrettable that the Council couldn't agree to extend the cross-border aid mechanism in northwest Syria in July, as the Syrian government's consent for the use of Bab al-Salam and Arai border crossing expires in November. We hope it will be extended. The lives of millions are at stake. Regarding the political situation, Japan is disappointed that the Constitutional Committee has been unable to reconvene in Geneva or elsewhere, and hopes that a venue can be agreed upon as soon as possible. We further encourage Special Envoy Pedersen's intensive diplomatic efforts to facilitate progress in the step-for-step approach, and we launch a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in line with Resolution 2254. creating conditions for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs is also critical. We look forward to receiving more updates from the Secretary General and OHCHR regarding the independent institution to clarify the fate of missing persons in Syria. Syria's rejoining the League of Arab States has sparked hope for a realistic path towards peace and stability in Syria and beyond. In this vein, the role of Arab Contact Group is crucial. However, Japan stresses the need for the Syrian government to participate meaningfully and in good faith in these efforts to move the political process forward. Mr. President, amidst the many conflicts and crises around the world, we must not forget the plight of the Syrian people. This Council must remain engaged, and Japan will spare no efforts to that end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wasorno for their briefings. As we've heard today, this remains a live conflict and an entrenched humanitarian crisis. I want to set out 3 tangible steps that would improve the situation for the people of Syria, and these overlap very closely with Special Envoy Pedersen's 4 priorities. First, we need to ensure sustainable, predictable, and efficient aid flows across the whole of Syria. There is no substitute for cross-border access to deliver for people in the northwest. Short-term, last-minute agreements are inappropriate. As Director Wasorno just said, we must insist that cross-border access is granted for as long as humanitarian needs demand across all 3 crossing points. We've also heard that humanitarian funding remains inadequate. The UK continues to be a top donor for Syrians in humanitarian need, pledging up to $180 million this year alone. But as a donor, we're concerned that 17 cents of every dollar in aid being sent to UN agencies based in Damascus is being lost to the regime, who manipulate exchange rates for their benefit. Secondly, at a fragile moment for the region, all parties should be focused on avoiding further escalation of conflict elsewhere in the Middle East. We're concerned at reports of increased Iranian-affiliated militia activity and increasing hostilities between Israel and militia groups in southern Syria. We call on the regime to prioritize de-escalation and to focus on fostering stability and prosperity. Thirdly, this backdrop of violence in the region underscores even more urgently the need for a viable political process in Syria. We call on the regime to act in good faith and engage. Thus far, attempts at normalization have not borne fruit. Insecurity persists, the Captagon trade continues, and the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees remains out of reach. The UK's position has not changed. We will not engage Damascus without evidence of genuine, consistent behaviour change. Resolution 2254 provides the framework to deliver an inclusive and sustainable political process. The Constitutional Committee has been deadlocked for too long. We strongly support efforts to convene a meeting with the Syrian parties alone, if necessary, in Geneva later this year. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we are grateful for the information provided by Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and by Director Edem Wasono of OCHA. We welcome the presence here of the permanent representatives of Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Ecuador rejects the violence which imperils the lives and integrity of civilians and echoes the call by the Secretary-General for all parties to commit to bring an end to the escalation in hostilities which further hamper the political and humanitarian situation in Syria and in the region. We express our condolences to the victims of the attacks and violent events in Damascus and Aleppo, which caused the deaths of hundreds of civilians, including women and girls, and boys. We reiterate the support to Special Envoy Pedersen in his efforts towards a negotiated solution to the conflict, particularly along with the Astana Group and the League of Arab States. We commend the work underway to increase and shore up the political will of a broad spectrum of stakeholders within and outside Syria, and actions aimed at achieving a ceasefire. We share the Special Envoy's concern that this disruption in the political negotiation process threatens to reverse the progress made in previous months around the possibility of reactivating the Constitutional Committee, as well as other measures aimed at fulfilling the provisions of Resolution 2254 of 2015. Syria is living through the worst resurgence in armed violence of the last 4 years, according to information provided by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And in this regard, we deem it essential to reassess strategies which will allow for a return to constructive dialogue. President, last week, during the open debate on women, peace and security, we listened to states discussing the importance of including women in all processes of building and consolidating peace. This delicate and complex security situation is also an opportunity to involve women in a full, equal, meaningful and safe way. Women and young people must be involved in all the phases of the political negotiation process. We note with concern the information from OCHA on the situation of 15 million people who depend on humanitarian assistance to survive, as well as the increase in the number of displaced persons due to the recent escalation in hostilities and the damage caused to schools and in critical infrastructure, which contravenes international humanitarian law. We urge donors to continue contributing to the humanitarian response plan for Syria in 2023, which is only 30% funded as we approach the end of the year. President, I conclude by recalling that the end of November will see the expiry of the authorizations for the use of the border crossings of Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai, and in December, the use of Bab al-Hawa will expire. We trust that the access to the northwest of Syria will be maintained indefinitely, alongside the guarantees of safety and freedom of movement for United Nations personnel and that of its partner agencies on the ground. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wasono for their briefings. In light of the recent situation, in light of the briefings, I'd like to make the following points. First, every effort must be made to avoid spillover of tensions. The political process in Syria cannot advance without stable regional environment for some time now. Amidst the escalating Palestinian-Israeli conflict, tensions along the Syrian-Israeli border on the rise. A number of locations in Syria, including the airports in Damascus and Aleppo, came under frequent airstrikes. We call upon all parties concerned to exercise maximum restraint in order to avoid hotspots feeding off each other and the spread of conflict, wreaking greater havoc on regional security. We hope that countries outside the region, especially major countries, will uphold objectivity and impartiality and play a constructive role in cooling off the situation. One must not call for de-escalation while acting in a way that exacerbates tensions. Secondly, we must remain committed to seeking a political solution at the